My name is Raymond Cofield, and I am 67 years old, and I spent 28 years as a civil engineer designing bridges. And I want you to understand something about bridges before I tell you what my wife did while I was unconscious on an operating table. Because bridges are not about the steel, and they are not about the concrete, and they are not even about the span. They are
about tension and compression working together in balance. And when that balance is disturbed quietly over time, the bridge does not fall. Dramatically, it develops a crack so small you need instruments to find it. And then one day, someone with the right instruments finds it, and everything changes. And I was the man with the right instruments, and I did not expect to need them in my own marriage, but that is where this story goes. And I want to start by telling you about the account from 1987 because it is the center of everything, and I will come back to it, but first I need you to understand how I got to the operating table and how my wife Patricia got to the decision she made while I was on it. Patricia and I had been married for 31 years, and I want to be honest with you the way I was always honest in my engineering reports, which is to say, I will tell you the true version, not the comfortable one. The marriage had been in trouble. For longer than either of us had named out loud, there was a distance that had grown the way distances grow in long marriages, not with a single argument, but with 1,000 small choices to say less and share less and stand slightly further apart. And I had noticed it, and I had suggested counseling twice. And Patricia had said she would think about it, and then had not thought about it, or if she had, the thinking had not led anywhere I was willing to follow, and I accepted this the way I had accepted difficult site conditions. On job sites, you work with what the ground gives you, and you adapt, and we had a life, and it was not unhappy. It was simply quieter than it had once been. And then in October, I went to my cardiologist for a routine checkup, and he was not satisfied with what he found. And 3 weeks later, I was scheduled for a cardiac procedure, not open heart surgery, but significant enough to require general anesthesia, and a full surgical team, and I was in the hospital for the procedure prep at 6 in the morning, and Patricia drove me, and she sat with me while they placed the IV, and she held my hand briefly when the anesthesiologist came in, and the last thing I remember before the medication took hold was the ceiling tiles above me, white and evenly spaced, and Patricia's face at the edge of my vision, and then nothing. And the procedure took 4 hours, and I came out of it well. The surgeon was satisfied, and I spent one night in the hospital, and Patricia was there when I woke up, and she was attentive, and she brought me water, and she asked the nurse questions, and she drove me home the next afternoon and helped me to the couch and brought me soup, and I was grateful, and I was tired, and I slept. And it was 4 days later when I received an email from my financial institution that I understood what had happened while I was unconscious, and the email was a routine notification, the kind that gets sent automatically when account beneficiary information is updated. And I sat on the couch, still in my recovery, and I read it twice, and then I read it a third time, and I want to tell you what I felt. And it was not anger, not immediately. It was the feeling I had once on a job site, when I put my instrument on a beam that was supposed to be solid, and the reading came back wrong, not dramatically wrong, not catastrophically wrong, just wrong in a way that told me something had been done to this structure that should not have been done, and I needed to find out how much. And I opened my laptop, and I logged into my accounts, and I looked at every beneficiary designation on every account we held, and Patricia had been thorough. I will give her that she had accessed our joint investment account, our joint savings, our life insurance policy, and our retirement account, and she had removed my name as primary beneficiary on all of them and replaced it with her sister Donna, and she had done this on the day of my surgery between the hours of 9 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, while I was under general anesthesia and could not have known. and could not have responded, and I sat with that information for a long time, and I thought about 31 years, and I thought about the quiet distance, and I thought about the counseling she had not pursued, and I thought about the fact that she had held my hand when the anesthesiologist came in, and I thought about all of it carefully the way I thought about engineering problems, which is without rushing, because rushing is how you miss the thing that matters most. And then I remembered the account from 1987. And I want to tell you about that account now, because it is the reason this story ends the way it does. In 1987, I was 23 years old, and I had just started my first engineering job, and my grandfather Ellis, who had worked in a steel mill for 40 years and believed in two things, which were hard work and independent money, sat me down at his kitchen table, and he said, "Raymond, I am going to show you something." And he took me to his bank, a small regional institution that had been in our town since 1951, and he helped me open an account, and he deposited $800 into it, which was a significant amount for him, and he said, "This account is yours alone, and you keep it yours alone, and you do not mention it to anyone, not a girlfriend, not a wife, not a friend, just yours." And I was 23, and I thought, this was old-fashioned thinking from a man of a different generation, and I almost did not take it seriously, but I respected my grandfather more than almost anyone I had ever known. And I kept the account, and I kept it separate, and I kept it quiet, and over 28 years of engineering work I had added to it steadily and conservatively the way my grandfather would have approved of, and it had grown in the way that accounts grow when you leave them alone and tend them patiently, and Patricia did not know it existed. And she had never asked, and I had never mentioned it, and my grandfather, Ellis, had died in 2003, and I had stood at his grave and thought about the kitchen table and the $800, and I had been grateful in the way you are. Grateful for things that were given to you before you understood their value. And sitting on my couch 4 days after surgery, I opened the app for that account on my phone, and I looked at the balance, and I thought about my grandfather, and I said out loud to the empty room, "Thank you, Ellis." And then I called my attorney, a man named George, who had handled my affairs for 19 years, and I told him everything from the surgery to the email to the beneficiary changes. And when I finished, George was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Raymond, how are you feeling physically?" And I almost laughed, because it was such a George question, practical and grounded, and I said, "I am recovering," and he said, "Good," and then he said, "Come in when you are ready, and we will talk about next steps." And I went to his office the following Tuesday, and we sat across from each other, and I told him about the 1987 account, and George looked at me for a moment and said, "She does not know about this account." And I said, "No," and he said, "And it is solely in your name." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Raymond, your grandfather was a very wise man." And I said, "I know." And we spent 2 hours in that office going through everything. And when I left, I had a plan. And the plan was not about revenge. I want to be clear about that, because I am not a man who thinks in terms of revenge. I am a man who thinks in terms of structural integrity. And what Patricia had done was remove herself from the foundation of this marriage, while I was unable to respond, and my job now was simply to document the crack and address it correctly. And over the following 3 weeks, while I continued to recover, I gathered everything: bank records, transaction logs, the timestamps on the beneficiary changes, the sequence of her access to each account, and I organized it the way I organized engineering documentation, clearly and completely, and with nothing left to interpretation, and I gave it to George. And George filed, and Patricia was served on a Thursday morning, and I was not in the house when it happened. I had driven to my brother Calvin's, and I stayed there for the week, and Calvin made coffee every morning without asking, and we watched football in the evenings, and he did not ask me too many questions, because Calvin understood that some things needed to be processed before they could be spoken, and the legal process was not fast, because these things are never fast, but it was thorough, and what George demonstrated was a pattern of financial manipulation. conducted during a period when I was medically incapacitated and unable to provide consent or response, and the beneficiary changes were reversed by court order and the legal process surfaced other financial movements. I had not yet found transfers to an account in Donna's name that had been made over the preceding 8 months, and the picture that emerged was not of a spontaneous decision made during a moment of marital crisis. It was of a plan that had been in development for longer than I had known, and I thought about the counseling she had not pursued, and I understood now that the reason she had not pursued it was not because she did not think the marriage was in trouble. It was because she had already decided what she was going to do about the trouble, and it did not involve repairing anything, and the 1987 account remained untouched and solely mine because Patricia had never known to look for it and had never asked and had never been told, and my grandfather Ellis, who believed in hard work and independent money, had been right in the way that people are right when they have lived long enough to understand things that younger people have not yet had cause to learn, and I am recovered now. Fully, the surgeon was pleased, and I walk every morning, and I have coffee on my porch, and I have gone back to some consulting work because I like the precision of it, and I like having somewhere to put my attention. And on the wall of my office, I have a photograph of my grandfather Ellis, taken sometime in the 1960s outside the steel mill where he worked for 40 years, and he is squinting into the sun, and he looks like a man who knows something, and I look at that photograph sometimes in the morning before I start work, and I think about the kitchen table and the $800 and the account that has been quietly there since 1987, waiting for the moment it would matter. And if someone gave you advice once that seemed old-fashioned or unnecessary, I want you to go back and think about it again. Because wisdom does not expire, and the things we are given before we understand their value are sometimes the most valuable things we will ever receive.